Hello, everybody. Ian Barkin here, back again with OneTAKE Live, streaming to you, at you on Twitter and LinkedIn Live. For those who are not familiar, the focus of OneTAKE is a chance for me to speak to visionaries, to academics, to game changers on the future of work, future of life, future of culture. And it's been broadening its aperture, especially as we've been home and sort of examining global trends that have impacted us all. Before we get started, I do want to mention that Sykes is always hiring. If anyone finds themselves looking for an opportunity, please do check out jobs.sykes.com. We've got a great and robust work at home program if you're looking for opportunities where you can maintain your livelihood and safety, especially during the current interesting times we're in. So there you have it. So let's get going with the show. Oftentimes we talk about digital transformation and we're talking about technology and we're talking about sort of its role and its impact on in transforming businesses. But my next guest both refers to that and approaches this from a really interesting series of points of view that include HR and people, as well as customers, companies, leadership, and in general mindset. So without further ado, I am thrilled to welcome Charlene Li to OneTAKE. Charlene, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you. This is the part of a live stream where I awkwardly keep talking about you as you sit there, and then you can correct anything I said wrong when I'm done. So Charlene, you're the founder and senior fellow at a company called Altimeter, which you founded and then sold to a profit company, which is very cool. So congratulations. You did that a few years ago. You are the author of 6 books, which is incredibly impressive. One of them hit the New York Times bestseller list. It was called Open Leadership. And you also co-authored a critically acclaimed book called Groundswell. And if that wasn't enough, you are transforming the space, sharing your perspectives, and you've been named one of the most creative people in business by Fast Company, which is why the first 10 minutes of this live stream are just going to be an art project in which I see just truly how creative you are. No, I'm just kidding about that. So there you have it. So welcome to the show. I'm thrilled to have you. I want to talk about several different elements of focus for you. Because you also taught some LinkedIn learning classes. That's how I have the privilege of having gotten to know you. You taught a class called HR and Digital Transformation and another class called Digital Leadership. Before we get into any of those details, though, I'd love to hear your backstory. You know, what did you want to do when you grew up? What did you go to school for? And how did you get to where you are today to have the insights you have to share with the world?
Well, I grew up in Detroit, just outside Detroit, was born there, and grew up the child of immigrants. And my father's a doctor, so I wanted to be a doctor when I grew up. But then I went to college, realized that no, that wasn't the path for me. So went on a series of explorations to try to figure it out and settle on business. And again, coming from an immigrant family, they just thought I was crazy because, like, why would you ever do that? You're not going to be successful. You're a woman. You're a person of color. You're short. I mean, nobody looks like you in business. So I decided to go into business and have not turned back. But my whole career has been focused on disruption. I started and came out of Harvard Business School and went into newspapers in 1993 because I believe that this thing called the internet was going to explode. And so made my bets there and have never turned back.
That's tremendous. I'm not a woman of color, and I guess I'm sort of short, but my parents were doctors, and I explored it for a little while too. But then I also went into business. I don't know if they thought I was crazy. They didn't know exactly what I was doing or what I was aspiring to achieve. So that's funny. We share something in common, but I love the backstory. So okay, so let's talk about. I want to start with your LinkedIn learning courses because I'm fascinated by the topic and the focus. And ultimately, what it was is you talk about digital leadership, but let's talk about the HR one for a moment. So HR and digital transformation. Your assertion, and I wholeheartedly agree and believe in it and have said this for years well, is that digital transformation is not about the technology, but it's about the people in an organization who are able to shape, design, and affect the change. And so therefore, HR is an extremely important, in fact, sort of imperative component to transformation. So talk about your research there and the course that you taught on the subject.
Right. Well, if you think about digital transformation, we focus too much on the digital and not enough on the transformation part. And this is a major reason, the number one reason why digital transformations fail is because you don't take into account that there's a people component to this. So if you're going to transform, the hard part isn't just putting in the technology. The really hard part is getting people to use it and to change the way they work. And so when you look at who is involved in digital transformation, it's almost never HR. And that's because HR typically plays a risk mitigation role inside of organizations. You're trying to hire the people who won't get you in trouble. You're trying to hire the people who will just get the job done and hopefully do it well. And otherwise, you're just trying to minimize your risk when it comes to your most important asset, your people. Trying to minimize the chances that they go away, for example. And it's not strategic in many cases.
Right. So if anyone is listening to this live stream from my HR department, thank you so much for what you do. Yes, that's a great point. Is their charge and their focus is in many cases to protect the company. And in digital transformation, you've got to go find and enable people to help, in some cases, change the company, even dare I say it, disrupt the company. So let's pivot to the disruption concept. And we talked about this before the show. Your most recent book is called The Disruption Mindset. And I love it for many reasons. I read the whole book, think it's great. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. But we got to start with the word. Disruption. It carries a lot of baggage. Some people think it's sort of a negative word. So how did you come to select that word for your philosophy and approach and for your book title?
Well, I think the world looks at disruption as a negative. And what I found in doing the research is that we also think of it as a positive in some ways when we think about disruptive innovation or disruptive technology, because those things tend to push things forward at an exponential rate. And so people kept asking me, so how do we, what technologies would we be using? What innovations would we be having to create that disruption? And I think people were looking at backwards. What you really want to do is create growth. And when you grow at exponential rates, when you grow at rates you never did before, that is disruptive. There's no way you can grow and make it be easy. And so the reason why I talk about disruption is I'm trying to tell the truth. If you're going to grow, it's going to be hard, it's going to be disruptive, and it's going to be incredibly uncomfortable. Right. So rather than try to avoid it, how do we live with it? How do we not just survive with disruption? How do we thrive with it? That's a different mindset.
So, and I told you a bit of a story before we got started, but I had a friend of mine who was a startup founder, and I told him at one point that I was trying to disrupt an industry, and I'd never thought of it as a negative, but his feedback to me made it clear that he did. He thought it was a negative and almost counseled me not to use the word, but it just felt right. It just felt like you're not trying to sort of gently change it. You big change, big meaningful, impactful change is, as you say, sometimes not gentle. It's not comfortable.
Well, I think about people who have a disruption mindset, people like yourselves who are trying to make change happen. What you see is that there's a status quo that's happening here, and you're not satisfied with the status quo. In fact, you're constantly looking around, you're being curious, you're being empathetic to the people who have these problems, and you say, we think we could do this better. There's got to be a better way. And so that is challenging the status quo, and in particular, challenging the power structures that exist. And so when people think of disruption as a negative thing, they're being challenged from their perception of the world, their view of the world, and the scaffolding that holds it up. And that scaffolding may be the only thing that holds it up because the reality has fundamentally shifted behind them.
Reality has fundamentally shifted behind them. I love that. So you talk about 3 elements of disruptive transformation. Before we get into them, It was too awesome and too much to memorize. So I've underlined it and will read it instead. But you start off relatively early in the book by defining disruptive transformation. And you say it's complicated and elusive. It's more than just the right mix of product, timing, and strategy. It requires transforming the entire organization and its culture. And that starts with the mindset and behaviors of the leadership team. It's a tremendous definition of disruptive transformation. How did you come to those realizations? What sort of organizations had you worked with, or problems had you helped leaders address that led you to that real holistic view of disruptive transformation?
Well, when I started looking at disruption as an analyst at Forrester back in 1999, the world was just about to explode because of the internet, World Wide Web, .com boom and everything. And the question that kept coming up again over and over is, what's being built here? Is it real? Is it not real? How disruptive is it truly going to be? And frankly, if you're an incumbent, if you're part of the status quo, how do you play a role in this? Or are you just going to be just shark chomp out there for all of the startups who are coming after you? And what I have found is over the past 20 years, people have been quite successful at doing this, but we never hear about them. How do they systematically build disruption into their organizations, into their strategies? How do they be disruptive leaders? And so I didn't want to tell the stories of the usual suspects, of the Facebooks and the Ubers and the Netflixes of the world. I want to talk about manufacturing, about education, about nonprofits, about healthcare systems and banks. Yes, banks can digitally transform, and not only that, disruptively transform. And the key things are these areas of how you think about strategy and leadership and culture completely differently if you're a disruptive organization.
Right. That's great, and thank you for not focusing on the same characters, because you're right, they get a lot of attention, but there are some really interesting disruptions in traditional industries. So let's go through this, because you, as I mentioned, you talk about 3 elements of disruptive transformation. The first one is you start with talking about your customers, but you describe a different form of customer than I've ever read before, which was really compelling and interesting. I won't steal the punchline. So please explain to us the type of customer that an enterprise should focus on.
Right. And what was interesting about all of these disruptive organizations, they did one thing, and one thing extremely well. They set their strategy based on future customers. So not the customers of today, but the future customers. And the reason they do that is because they know that their customers are moving faster and faster away from them than they can possibly follow them. And if they only concentrated on the customers today, they're going to be building something that's going to be obsolete by the time they're finished. So instead, they focus on where the customers are going, literally where this puck is going to be, paraphrasing Wayne Gretzky, so they could skate to it. And this is incredibly difficult because it means setting aside some of the resources, the investments, the people, and having them not work on problems today, but problems of tomorrow. And if you're not completely 100% sure about what that future looks like, and no one is 100% sure because it's uncertain, it could be written, and just look at the past 6 months. All your plans just went out the door. Mm-hmm. But I think this is the key thing that disruptive organizations do so well. They focus so much on those future customers.
So I would imagine so much of your entrenched behavior and just your instinct is shaped by your existing customers. So how do you enable a team to shake that habit and focus on, as you say, something that may not even exist yet, in the direction a puck may be traveling, but they've never been there before?
That's such a great question. And this is why having a really clear picture, a really good understanding of who your future customer is extremely valuable. When I go in and start an engagement with companies, I ask them 3 questions. Tell me what your strategy is. And I basically go around and ask for permission to walk around the organization for an hour. Just give me an hour, give me a map where everyone sits so I can just run around and ask a bunch of people questions. And I ask, what's your strategy? Can you tell me what it is? Can you tell me who your future customer is? And then show me your dashboard. What are you being measured by? Is your future customer on that dashboard? And if you don't have those 3 elements and where everybody is aligned around this, that's called a strategy, The strategy isn't a three-ring binder that sits on some desk someplace, on a shelf someplace. It is a living, breathing entity, and it has to be focused on a really clear definition of what success and what that objective is. And that future customer focuses that strategy and the entire organization on the job to be done.
That's great. I'm going to be disruptive as soon as we get off this call and go ask everyone those same questions around my organization. I think some people might know, but it's I'm sure that's a powerful 1 hour that illustrates really many gaps that a company may or may not know that they have. So, okay, so you've got your future customer. You have another term that you associate with the future customer, which I like, reminds me of 7-Eleven a bit, but I don't think necessarily you mean that. But you talk about what is the big gulp moment. What is a big gulp moment?
As you're pursuing your future customer and you're going after this disruption strategy, there's going to come a moment, if you're truly being disruptive, where you're going to have to make a big decision. You're going to have to push a button when you are not 100% sure. In fact, you may be just 50% sure or even 25% sure, and you have to push a button and go for it. And it's going to be unnerving. Mm-hmm. That's when you take that big gulp, look around, your colleagues will be on the same page. Yeah, we're ready to go. Okay, we're going to jump. And it's incredibly terrifying when you reach that moment.
Right.
And that's when you know you're doing it right.
Well, and so you talk now about, so let's move on to the second element, because you start to talk about how you really do need to build a case for any of this disruption. And that case is predicated on some form of data to at least justify some of the gut that you are using to make that big gulp leap. So element 2, you talk about leadership that creates a movement of disruptors. And you had a quote in the book that effectively, something about how you need to, I'm trying to remember what it was, but it was ultimately that you disruption isn't something that you can control. It sort of takes hold and has an effect on the company. So walk me through, how can a leader really create this disruptive movement within the organization?
Right. I think the most important thing is that disruption does need to be a movement, primarily because this is so difficult to do that if you take on all the onus of trying to create that disruption, it's only going to be as big as your span of control. And in order for this to be really effective, you need everyone around you, your entire ecosystem, not just the people in your organization, but your partners, your suppliers, your customers even, to be behind this and understand what you're trying to do. And so that requires a very different form of leadership. It's about creating that movement. And by having that clear focus, again, on that future customer, who are you trying to serve? What are you trying to do? Right. And being crystal clear about what that mission and purpose is. That's
great. I remember the quote was that movements aren't controlled, they're inspired, which I loved. And I really like that concept of the boundaries, the aperture needs to open beyond simply the organization or even your function within the organization, but has to have your stakeholders, including suppliers, vendors, and I would imagine even your existing customers today. Is it possible for existing customers to evolve and follow you on your disruption journey, or do you end up leaving them behind?
Well, the thing is that people assume that if you're focused on your future customers, you're ignoring your current customers, and that's not true. Yeah. You're still serving them. You're doing a great job of talking to them, but you also recognize that they're probably not that growth edge of the future, or they might be, but you should ask the question, are these people going to be the places where I'm going to find that growth? If not, then I'm going to keep serving them, but that's not where I'm going to put my focus in the future. Love my current customers, but I'm not going to have them hold me back.
Do you put a lot of stock in the trend, fad, perhaps in some cases, around design thinking? Is that helpful in helping you define who that future customer is? And would you involve some of your current customers in those design thinking exercises?
Yes, I think design thinking is seen as a trend, but it comes to fundamentally this thing. Can you have empathy for who your customers that you are trying to serve? No. And the focus here is understanding your future customers. I love the use of what I call empathy maps. This is a core staple of design thinking. And it says, don't try to describe that future customer in terms of demographics or psychographics. Just have empathy for them. Tell me what they do, what they say, what they think and what they feel. Give me this full picture of who this person is, and then understand how that is driving and changing the needs that they have. And the beautiful thing about empathy maps, anybody in the organization can use them. And it's a fantastic way for people to understand and see who your future customer is, so that if you happen to run across one, you pay close attention to them.
That's great. So, okay, so we talked about building the case. You talk about securing buy-in through transparency. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in openness, and it's one of the core beliefs of disruptive organizations. And what transparency does, it says if you're going to say something, you better well follow up and through with it. Because when you're in a leadership organization, if you don't know what somebody has committed to, do they actually deliver? And so openness creates transparency, and therefore creates accountability, because there's no place to hide. And in the end, what you want is for everybody to understand exactly what we're trying to go after, what we're trying to do, and if we're meeting those goals or not. And this isn't about, holding everybody like you haven't done your job. It says that if I'm falling behind, I know that everyone else knows, and they're going to come and help me move forward as fast as we can. So this is not an issue around execution of an individual. It's about how do we pull together as an entire team and organization to make this happen.
Great. So the next one after transparency is burn the boats. And before I have you explain that, I'm going to start by saying you had me at the word disruption on the cover of the book. Loved it. Then you quoted Wayne Gretzky. So that's bonus points. Then you go ahead and not only give an Alexander the Great reference, but the pièce de la résistance is you quote Yoda. And at this point, I'm loving the book, loving you. It's all working for me. So with that setup, burn the boats. What do you mean by that? And thank you for quoting Yoda.
Sure thing. I just wish I had gotten Jean-Luc Picard in there. So
oh my goodness,
do that.
Oh wow, yeah.
When it comes to these things, the burn the boats is from Alexander the Great. When he landed, he basically, it was an impossible odds, and he basically ordered all the boats that they had landed in to be burned. And his soldiers were going, "What are you doing? This is our escape route." He goes, "We either defeat the enemy, and we will go back and sail back to our homeland in their boats, or we will die trying." So burn the boats. There's no retreat. It's either success or we die. And this seems really extreme in some ways, but as long as people believe that there's a retreat from this hard journey of disruption, and they don't have to go forward, they could always go back. They're going to go back. Because that's a lot easier. Go back to the status quo. Go back to where we came from. That was comfortable. We knew what was happening. This road is too hard. At some point, you have to burn the boats and saying, we're not going back.
That's right. Do or do not. There is no try. When you cannibalize your existing business, you've effectively started burning the boats in a way that is very difficult to stop. Because you're introducing a competitive product or reality. Clients now know that that's an option. Let's, for example, say on-premise technologies that now can be hosted in the cloud. Is that an example of burning the boat, where you just commit to these, like a new software as a service cloud model, and there's no going back?
Yeah, absolutely. And the biggest problem is why people don't cannibalize themselves is they don't know what they're building towards. If I eat my own, well, what's the other thing that's going to replace this? Is it bigger, better? Is it why would I do this unless I believe there was a better future? And that's exactly what Adobe did. They said no more packaged software. We're going to go into the cloud. As you can imagine, this was incredibly difficult because, first of all, none of the customers were asking for this. In fact, they signed petitions. 50,000 of them signed a petition saying, we don't want this. We want to go back. And, the employees were up in arms, like, this is really hard. And they were a publicly traded company, and they were going to take the company to be unprofitable for 2 years. Who does that? And the amazing aspect of this whole story is that the executive team never blinked. They burned the boats. They made the big up decisions. They went to Wall Street, told them the story, and every time their profits went down, their stock price went up.
Interesting.
That doesn't happen.
Right.
That's
Right.
your disruption strategy.
Well, and so that's sort of a killer combo, because that's the transparency element coming back as well, because as you said, they're just straight up honest about what it is they were doing, the purpose for having done it, and ultimately they were recognized for it, and it succeeded for them. Very interesting. So okay, so let's move to element 3, which is culture. And you say a culture needs to thrive with disruption. You need to enable an organization to effectively not become the chum and not suffer and struggle and fail, but really thrive here. So how does an organization do that? And I guess this really is segueing into just leadership. What do leaders at every level of a company need to do to enable disruption?
Right. Well, if a strategy focused on your future customer is your roadmap, then culture is the engine that drives and determines how fast you're going to go down that road. So your culture needs to be really tuned to go after this disruption. And a culture is made up of 2 things fundamentally: the beliefs and then the behaviors. And those 2 things then drive the results that come out of your culture. And so what I found is that there were 3 common beliefs consistent across disruptive organizations: their openness, agency, and a bias for action. Now, these things take on many, many different types of names, but they're consistent across disruptive organizations because they allow you to go fast. They allow you to remove the friction that's usually there that hold organizations back from being able to move out of that status quo. And I love the openness one because we talked about that earlier, but the fundamental thing here is that openness creates that transparency, the accountability that in the end builds trust. And if you do not have trust in your culture built in at the fundamental levels, you're not going to go on this hard journey. You're not going to believe people. You're not going to be able to have those tough conversations and disagree with each other when the time comes, because this is, again, really, really hard.
So openness, agency, and bias for action. You call those flux? Is that correct?
And I think I call it a flux culture.
Flux culture, right? Okay. And I like how you talk about effectively a flux culture operating system, which is an interesting way to think of a culture as like almost a software program operating system for an enterprise. How does that apply? How is it an operating system?
Well, once you know what your beliefs are, again, it could be any of these beliefs that are based on your values, your mission, and purpose. But once you know what your beliefs are, you want to make sure that the organization understands what it is and practices it. So you can change your structure so that it's, again, tuned around openness and agency and bias for action. You can change your processes to be much more focused on meeting those customer needs, to speed everything up, remove the processes that are holding you back. And then finally, there's an area called lore. These are the soft parts of the culture. So there are things like rituals that recognizing the passing of time and achievements, of welcoming and saying goodbye. But also when we achieve and actually meet our goals, what are the rituals of how we do that? That create, frankly, belonging. And we've been talking about belonging and inclusion, especially in a place where there may not be as many diverse people. If you're the only person in the room, I so strongly believe this, again, as having been the only person in the room, unless you have that really strong sense of belonging and that you feel safe, you're never going to raise your hand and disrupt. Never raise your hand and disagree with somebody. So we talk about diversity all the time, but diversity is a number. Right. Belonging is a mindset and a culture.
That is powerful. I want to drill down on that. Before I drill down on that, I do want to remind myself to welcome guests to the live stream, this has been so fascinating. I have not done that. So I'm going to take a break for a moment. I want to welcome Shay from Boston, Russ from Tampa, Steve Rockwell from Philly. Thank you for joining us. Steve was a guest on the show several months back. Caroline Logan from the UK, AJ Hanna, also a guest on the show from Indianapolis, Fernando Castro from Argentina. Hello, Fernando. Sue from Florida, Tomas from Poland. Hello. Nalita from Brazil, Rachel from Florida, Caroline, actually, and Will Harris. Will writes, he writes that he loves what you said, that belief and behavior, behavior without belief is false, belief without behavior is daydreaming. It's just so powerful. And the only correction I'd make is that Will spelled behavior with a U in it. But I won't hold that against him because he's in England. Okay, so I had to rib Will a little bit. You were talking about diversity and inclusion and belonging. You in the book talk about archetypes of leadership, and it really did resonate with me, especially in light of discussions that the world is having right now. I even tabbed it to show it off. But you talk about there are 4 disruptive leadership archetypes, and you go so far as to break it down and show how they're different by gender. Walk us through that, the different archetypes and the differences by gender, and what organizations need to really consider and do with that information.
Yeah, sure. It did a survey of 1,000 leaders from all around the world, and did some factor analysis and figured out that there were 2 factors that were determinant of a person's ability to be disruptive. And I define disruptive as being able to drive levels of exponential growth in your organization. And so the first factor was an openness to change mindset. And the second one was leadership behaviors really focused on empowering and inspiring people. Again, very much tied to this idea of creating movements. And what I found was that there were 4 segments, if you do a 2 by 2, those things of people who are high in both of realist optimists, people who are high in that leadership behavior, but not so much in terms of that openness to change mindset, which I call the managers. And then the third one was the provocateurs, who are, again, very high in change mindset, but not that capable of actually getting things done. And then we have the worried skeptics, who are low in both. And what I found across the board is that women across the board just rated themselves as lower in their disruptive capability, especially coming from the US. And this is true even if they had the same levels of achievement around the openness to change mindset and then that leadership behaviors. And this makes sense because, again, if you're the only woman in the room, you're doing everything you can to just belong, to just hold your space there. And the last thing you're going to do is to stand out and not belong and raise your hand and be disruptive. So, and I think there's also this negative connotation around what disruptive means. So we don't want to make waves. We want to kind of fit in again and make everyone happy.
Right.
But
well, that's I guess it's a disappointing and disturbing paradox that is, you want to fit in, and by fitting in, you're actually detracting from your ability to contribute to the disruption that enterprises need to transform and survive.
Right. And
so we as an organization, we as leaders need to take it upon ourselves to not only sort of understand any perhaps unconscious bias, but also understand the impact that might be having on tapping into the talents of our team.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things is that if you're the only person in the room, it's just so tempting for leaders and other people to say, speak up, be the representative of your particular segment, whatever it is that's different that we don't understand. That's not my job. That's not my job to be the only person, a woman, the only young person, the only old person, the only whatever. My job is to be a contributing member of the team, and I'm going to bring my full self. And it's especially now when we ask our African-American and Black colleagues to represent, that's not their job. Our job is to understand who they are and do everything even more so to make sure that they are included and feel belonging. Because when you're sitting there and segmenting them out, that's like the worst thing you could be doing. And so I look at what we can do to make a change around this is that if you know there is a person who is the only, or could potentially feel that way, take an extra minute, take that extra step to say your voice matters. What can I do to create that safe space for you to make sure you're comfortable? Just even check, are you comfortable? Do you feel included? The employee engagement surveys that go out rarely ask, do people feel like they're included? Or more importantly, do you feel like you belong? Do you feel like you're a part of that tribe? This is not just about engagement, but do you truly, truly feel that everyone has your back?
Interesting. Oh, thank you for saying that and putting it that way. It sounds like the openness and approaching your team with openness almost enables greater levels of both trust and agency, which then enables them to contribute to the bias for action. So, two last topics I want to touch on in the time we have left. So the first is you talk about effectively, and again, back to the operating system, but effectively the organizational structure. There's a bit of a paradox almost in that the ones that would seem like they're the most rigid and most strict are in fact the ones you say that your research shows are the ones that enable and support disruption and transformation. Talk about that.
Right. It was one of the biggest paradoxes is that the companies who were incredibly well run had really strong structures and processes and lore, rituals, all those things were actually the most disruptive ones. And you would think that disruptive organizations are sort of chaotic. There are no boundaries or anything. And it's just the opposite. They have really clear rules. They have really clear process and really clear structure. This is not to say, though, that they're rigid, because we almost equate structure with being rigid. Actually, the structures are built in place to give them flexibility, to define how those relationships work. The processes are just enough there so that you never have to worry about, like, how do I get things done? That process is already written out. You know exactly how we're going to make decisions, what information is needed, how we're going to go about making these kinds of disruptive moves. So that process is done. So all I have to focus on is how high can I jump? How fast can we go? I can focus on the work. I can spend 100% of my efforts on that crazy idea and not focus and be distracted by, like, who do I have to get involved in this process? Right. So that's the beauty of these disruptive organizations. They have it locked down on how to be disruptive.
Right. You'd mentioned that banks was an example. Industrial organizations are ones where you like to talk about the disruption and you highlight them in the book. Do you tend to find that those more sort of established organizations have that rigor that creates that safety that enables that disruptive thinking, or is it different from one organization to the other?
It's really different. In every industry, I find people who have that disruption mindset, that organizational structure and focus on growth, and I find tremendous laggards. Okay. So, I mean, you find it across every single industry. And make no mistake, every single industry is being disrupted. There is no safe space for this. I was even talking to one CEO of a sand manufacturing company. Now, you would think sand is a component, right? It's just the raw materials. How disruptive can it be? Until you realize that sand is a key component for glass. And glass is this really important thing that goes into our devices now. And so it's huge amount of disruption happening there. So they, instead of just selling to distributors, they now have to talk to tens of thousands of people who buy glass in the material science so they can understand what they need to build in terms of sand for the future.
That's interesting. One of the coolest business school cases I ever read was about glass manufacturing, and you're right. You don't think about all that goes into it, but it is amazing and critical to so many different industries now. So let's leave with one. You talk about as one of your recommendations on how an organization can kind of create these action steps and set themselves up for success is you suggest they write a manifesto. What should one do to write a manifesto, and what should it look like?
Right. I think manifestos are incredibly powerful because it's more than just a purpose statement or a single mission statement. Right. It is this page long or so, and you're talking about how you see the world, how it could be different, how it's what's wrong with the world today. And so the right one, you start with a rant. You talk about what's wrong with the world. I think the world is broken because of these reasons, and then you flip it. And you say, because the world is broken this way, it should actually work this way. And then you talk about the actions you will take to make that world happen. And you do this as a team. It's an incredibly freeing circumstance because you're talking about the hopes and dreams and how we're going to get there and the problems we're going to solve. So I think manifestos for organizations, but even manifestos for ourselves as individuals can be incredibly powerful, very motivating documents.
Start with a rant. I didn't expect you to say that, but I love it. It's cathartic, where you leave it all out there, and then you, as you said, you flip it and you structure it, and then you get productive and you figure out how to actually influence change. You also, and I'll make sure that we put a link to this in the show notes, because there was a blog you recently wrote that was on your website. It was called 5 Ways to Be a Strong Leader in Disruptive Times. And you talk a lot about all the different topics you just mentioned, about developing a disruption mindset, creating accountability with transparency. I guess my final question is, who is that leader? Who is responsible for setting up this sort of environment for disruptive change and creating those safety nets to be truly creative? Is that just the CEO? Does it just come from the C-suite, or does it come from other areas in the company?
It's so easy to say it's somebody else's job, but when I ask that person, they say it's always somebody else's job. And the way I come down to this is, I don't think that leadership is a title. I don't think that disruption knows any bounds by industry or department levels. If you're going to be hit by disruption, and you clearly are, then everyone has a role to play. It's about understanding who that future customer is. And guess who talks to customers the most but the people at the front lines? The salespeople, the people in finance who talk about accounts, people in customer service. They're the leaders. They're the people who are going to be leading this movement, because they understand the needs of who these future customers are. And the big difference between now and what we were 5 or even 10 years ago is that we have a way to connect all of the people in our ecosystems, inside our organizations, with artificial intelligence, with data flows, with collaboration platforms. We can do this. We can actually connect all together now and understand who that future customer is, align, and then execute against who that is. We couldn't do this before. That's the big difference.
Beautifully put. And bonus points for saving AI to the sort of last few seconds of this. It's outstanding. I love that, again, you really are focused on the people and the organization and the culture and the change. Charlene Li, thank you so much for your time, for your insights. I really did. I loved this book, and we'll put links to it, because I suggest everybody who has any interest in playing a role in the truly global and multifaceted change going on around the world should read it. I love that philosophy of really movements aren't controlled, they're inspired. And I'm inspired by that. So thank you for your creativity, and thanks again for spending time with OneTAKE and our listeners. And for everyone else, hope you're all safe, sound, and please join us again soon. Thank you, everybody.